With a 200 to 230 margin, Democrats in the House of Representatives seem to have jumped on the bandwagon in favor of impeachment. But presidential candidate and Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard says voters must be the one to remove a president from office.
Joining us now to discuss her reaction to plans to move forward with an impeachment inquiry, corruption in politics, the Democratic debate, and so much more is Congresswoman Gabbard.
Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks
we really
for being
appreciate
here.
it.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Of course. So first of all, the top of the news at today, there's of course the transcript of the President of the United States' phone call with Ukraine that has been released. You've spoken previously about impeachment last night. You thought it would be incredibly divisive for the country. This is something that much of the caucus, though, seems united in pursuing. Has your mind changed on the issue of impeachment after that transcript has come out?
It hasn't.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think when you step outside of the bubble here in Washington and you get to where most folks in the country are, look, I'm not a lawyer, but I think most people reading through that transcript are not going to find that extremely compelling cause to throw out a president that won an election in 2016. And instead, what I think most people will see is, hey, this is another move by Democrats to get rid of Donald Trump, further deepening the already hyper-partisan divides that we have in this country. And that's really where I'm coming from. Look, Donald Trump is corrupt. He is unfit to serve our country as president. He is unqualified to serve our country as commander-in-chief. I'm running for president to defeat him. I just think it's so important for our country to be able to move forward, to bridge these divides, that it be the American people that make this decision.
Mm-hmm. Let's put a little bit of the transcript up with regards to what he said about Vice President Biden. He said specifically in speaking with the Ukrainian president. The other thing, there's a lot to talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution. A lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the attorney general would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me. I mean, that sure sounds like the President of the United States pressuring a foreign ally to go after a political opponent.
He is using his position for his own political gain. I think that's very clear. It's also not surprising. Yeah. I mean, this is something that Donald Trump has been doing throughout his time in the White House, both here in our domestic politics, in his relationships with other countries. So this is again further just another example of his corruption and how self-serving he really is. You know, we need a president who will put the interests of the American people first and foremost, put the interests of our country first, and Donald Trump is not that guy.
What do you say to people who say, is there any line that he could cross? You know, of course impeachment would be divisive, but there has to be check and balance. We have to uphold the rule of law. He's gone way beyond what's appropriate or proper for a president. We have to draw the line somewhere.
I don't like to speak in hypotheticals, take every situation as they come, but the American people are aware of what is happening. They are seeing how this thing is playing out. And I think it's, again, most important for them to be the ones who make the decision about who our next president should be, understanding how self-serving this president is and why it's important that we as a country, Democrats, Republicans, independents, come together to defeat him.
Congressman, I also want to ask you actually about the underlying charge that the president is making there against Joe Biden, who is your opponent in this race. There's been a lot of discussion. His son received $50,000 a month from a Ukrainian energy company. He apparently was part of a private equity firm that inked a $1.5 billion deal with the Chinese government. Do you think those are legitimate lines of inquiry for any of his opponents, and do you find them problematic and evidence of corruption?
I'll be very honest. I don't know the details of what Hunter Biden was doing or who he was working for, what kind of interactions he was having, whether it be with Ukraine or any other country. I think for all of us who are running for president, our records are up for examination by the voters in this country, and it's up to us to be able to answer those questions and to speak to the kind of leadership that we seek to bring. And obviously, Vice President Biden is subject to that as well.
Yeah.
I think corruption is a deep concern that a lot of Americans have. That's not a partisan issue, frankly.
I agree with that.
Politicians on the left and the right have all personally cashed in on their positions. Their family members have cashed in. If you were president, how would you put an end to that?
by closing the revolving door and closing so many of these loopholes that allow elected officials to personally benefit, whether it be financially, through influence, or through power, that we've seen, as you said, rightly so. I mean, this is people from both political parties have too often been more self-serving for themselves or their family members, rather than seeing this incredible opportunity that we have as a job of service. It is a service to the American people who are entrusting us with their votes. You know, I think one example that often comes up is members of Congress who are able to impact and vote on legislation that will help their stock holdings. You know, I mean, there was legislation that was passed that would have banned that, and then of course it was overturned, so that this is something that's allowed to continue. There are so many examples, too many examples, that show how members of Congress come into this position with very little financially and somehow leave 5-10 years later, you know, millionaires, multimillionaires. And it does beg the question, what's really going on there in Washington? And the American people say, hey, I know one thing is true. Washington is filled with self-serving politicians who are beholden to the very few, the rich and powerful, rather than truly embodying the vision that Abraham Lincoln laid out for us, being a government of, by, and for the people. And that is where we've got to get back to.
Well, I know corruption is one of the main themes of many of your opponents in this race. You just qualified for the 4th Democratic debate.
Congratulations.
Congratulations on that. Crystal and I are very glad to see you up there, particularly to talk about foreign policy. Let's talk a little bit about that process. Was it frustrating to see the DNC choose which polls would and would not qualify? And do you feel that there was some unfairness in that process? It's great that you made it up on the stage, but you weren't there for the third time, the third debate.
There's been a lack of transparency in that whole process about which polls are selected, which aren't, which they're seeing as qualifying, which ones are actually polling. And when you have a lack of transparency for voters in our Democratic primary process, then you're seeing the lack of trust starting to grow, or they're saying, what's really going on here? And they're very spending time with voters in Iowa and New Hampshire, they don't take kindly to seeing how a few people in Washington, D.C. At the DNC are trying to be the gatekeepers to say, well, here are the people we think you should be allowed to choose from as voters, and you don't get to hear from any of these other people, because they recognize and take the responsibility that they have as voters very seriously in determining who our Democratic nominee should be, and eventually who will go on to be president.
So 538 recently noted that I think one of the latest polls out of Iowa was great news for Tulsi Gabbard. That was part of the headline. You've spent quite a bit of time in Iowa. What is something in Washington and the political press corps is completely missing about what you see on the ground that really animates and is animating voters in Iowa, and explains your own rise in that poll?
I'll say two things that Washington is completely missing. I think there's a lot that we could talk about. When you see the disconnect between what's driving headlines and tweets here in D.C. versus the questions people are asking in our town hall meetings. But what I am inspired by, and what I draw hope from, is that at every single one of our gatherings, small or large, big city, small town, we have Democrats, Republicans, independents, libertarians coming together, recognizing, hey, we don't agree on everything. There are some things we even strongly disagree on, but they're coming together recognizing how central the issue of the cost of war is to being able to resolve so many of the challenges we face here at home. So whether your top issue is healthcare or education or infrastructure, criminal justice reform, immigration reform, it requires resources. And unless we deal with this terribly high cost of war, this high human cost of war, the trillions of dollars that have been taken out of our pockets, out of our communities, out of our schools, healthcare system, and so on, going to pay for these wasteful regime change wars, and now this new Cold War and arms race, unless we deal with this, we will not have the resources that we need to either put that money back into the pockets of the American people or use those resources to serve the American people. And that's where our campaign is growing, our support is building in a way that is unifying the American people, saying we love our country, we will put the interests of the American people first, end these wasteful regime change wars, this new Cold War and arms race, and do just that, redirect those dollars back towards nation building, our communities right here at home.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.